Technical difficulties cannot get in the way of angels.
Amen. Amen.
Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of our collective hearts be acceptable in thy sight, for you are truly our rock and our Redeemer.
Yes. Amen.
Let's turn back to the gospel reading. Luke 24:13-35. I will read the entire reading. Now on that same day, 2 disciples were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there these last days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that had indeed seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory? Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself and all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on, but they urged him strongly, saying, 'Stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is now nearly over.' So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, 'Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?' That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, 'The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon.' Then they told what had happened on the road, and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of bread."
Amen. Amen.
Let us consider the Emmaus Journey. The Emmaus Journey. Disappointment is a key ingredient in measuring success. It's not the heights that we attain, but rather it's the depths from which we have come. The disillusionment, the defeat, the discouragement that represent the true measure of success. How do we deal with disappointment? However you and I answer that question may go a long way in determining the amount of peace that we have in our lives.
Amen.
I raise this issue of disappointment for two reasons. First, we all must deal with disappointment at some point in our lives. Amen. Second, disappointment is what's driving this morning's text. It is disappointment that it has at least two men on the Emmaus Journey. This passage is very rich. It is a passage that no matter what the preacher focuses on, it cannot help but be somewhat inadequate, especially if the preacher is committed to limiting his or her sermon to 20 minutes or no more.
Amen.
Therefore, I would strongly encourage all of you to conduct a home Bible study on this passage, allowing this sermon to perhaps serve as the beginning of the discussion in order to pose the overriding question, where am I on the Emmaus Journey? This passage, along with other post-Easter narratives, indicates there was something different about the resurrected Jesus that made recognizing him somewhat more difficult. Apparently, it didn't require too much effort on the part of Jesus to keep from being identified until he was ready to make himself known. But seldom was the shock of recognition quite as strong as in this story, partly because of the sheer amount of time Jesus had spent with these two Emmaus-bound travelers before they knew who he was. Jesus conversed with Mary in the garden, according to John's version, and it wasn't that long before he made himself known to her, and she cried out, Rabboni, which means teacher. Cleopas and his disciple and his walking companion had been with Jesus maybe several hours before they knew who he was, thus magnifying their shock and their joy in the end.
Amen.
After all, even at a good walking clip, allowing for some brief breaks, a journey of 7 miles will take at least 3 hours. And that was the Easter afternoon trip that these disciples had set out. They were on a 7-mile trek taking them from Emmaus. But what they were really doing, taking them to Emmaus, but what they were really doing was getting the hell out of Dodge.
Right.
Or in this case, they were getting out of Jerusalem. In all likelihood, they would have left sooner, but being observers of the Sabbath, they waited. But the Sabbath was over. And now it was time to leave Jerusalem. Disappointment, doubt, disillusionment, defeat, discouragement, and death are all words that sum up how Cleopas and his companion were feeling as they drudged up the road toward Emmaus. They had left a downhearted, confused band of disciples who were afraid and bewildered over what had happened to Jesus on Good Friday. The two men, as they traveled along, were also sad and disillusioned. The one they had loved and had followed had been horribly put to death, a cruel and degrading death on the cross. Jesus had been made a public spectacle, exposed to the jeers of all who passed by. Only a week before, their hopes had risen to fever pitch when their excited crowds welcomed Jesus with palm branches and shouts of Hosanna. But now, Jesus lay dead in a sealed tomb. Their hopes were dashed and their dreams over. Even the report of the women that Christ's tomb was empty didn't raise their spirits, it only confused them further. The two despondent disciples walking the road to Emmaus summed up the situation very neatly when they said, we had hoped he would be the one to set Israel free. See, these two brothers had to get out of town. Perhaps it was too painful to leave, but I suspect it was too painful to stay. To stay would be to dwell in the midst of their disappointment, their shattered dreams, and their broken hopes. See, Jerusalem for them was paralyzed by what had transpired on that past Friday. On that day, Jerusalem was granted the distinction of being the city where Jesus was killed.
Right.
We've had examples throughout history where the level of evil can blind one to any good they can possibly offer. To simply mention the word Auschwitz, evil is perhaps the first thing that comes to mind. Probably the same holds true for some would say Hiroshima, Wounded Knee, Cape Town, South Africa. It took several decades, in fact 50 years, for cities like Birmingham, Dallas, Memphis to not be defined by the evil acts that were conducted there. But Jerusalem is also a holy city. So it's not simply leaving the source of the pain. Jerusalem also represents a part of their faith and their hope and their anchor. See, that in part were where these two brothers in our text were also walking away from. As the days pass, I'm quite certain their grief intensified. We know what that's like. It's the day after the funeral that's far more difficult than the days that have been filled with formal activities and rituals that serve as a temporary numbing agent to keep our minds off of the pain.
Amen.
It's when the official ceremonies are over and you're all alone in your home and again, and that's when it really hits.
That's right.
So it was for these two brothers. See, the new week had begun. Jerusalem was back to business. The vendors on the streets. The marketplace was abuzz. Life quite simply went on, but not for these two. But as committed members of Jesus' movement, how can the world go on after they had suffered a loss so deep they find it difficult to breathe?
Right.
And I've got a feeling that the two in our text are not the only ones here that know that type of suffocating loss that makes it difficult to breathe, difficult to cope, difficult to maintain the facade that everything is all right, because you know deep down in your soul everything ain't all right. And now the pain is bubbling up uncontrollably to the surface. You ever feel like that? I know I have. And now these two disciples have to get away from it all. I don't blame them. I understand that type of pain. I might do the same thing. There's nothing more for them there, not in Jerusalem. Jerusalem had become like the house after someone dies. It is at once too empty of people and too full of memories. That's the Emmaus Journey, my friends. It is the path that takes us away from the disappointment and pain. That's not to suggest that we have dealt with the disappointment and pain. It just means that we have to get away from it because the pain becomes that intense.
That's right. That's right.
And just as it was true for Jerusalem being the holy city, sometimes our disappointment actually emanates from the church. The church can be as good as any at providing disappointment and pain individually and collectively. We've done a good job of really hurting folks, sometimes permanently. What would you do when you come to worship God in spirit and in truth, and you're greedy with pain? Sometimes your pain has to run up against somebody else's pain. That's why folks treat you bad sometimes.
That's right. That's right.
That might be enough to send you permanently on the Emmaus Journey. But the problem for the Emmaus Journey is it tends to be reactive rather than proactive.
Right.
See, it takes us away from the possibility of being strengthened by our disappointments. While on the Emmaus Journey, it becomes more difficult for us to trust God because of our preconceived expectations of God have led to a crisis of faith. See, beginning in verse 13, now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing